Good morning. Thank you, Adam, for that comprehensive, generous introduction. I'm Steve Weisman with the Peterson Institute, and it's certainly an honor to be here and to inaugurate this unusual session and set of sessions. As Adam said, this is a diverse group, and with not merely policymakers, but also ethicists and philosophers to help us understand the phenomenon of globalization. You know, economics is generally the study of trade-offs. Today we're going to talk not only about economic trade-offs, but also ethical trade-offs. It's sometimes said that Americans debate economics in ethical terms rather than economic terms. I mean, we are seeing an example of that now with the government response to the global financial crisis. On the one hand, many economists are calling for more spending. On the other hand, the American public and large parts of the population resist the advice of economists, not because they say that it doesn't work, but because it doesn't feel right ethically to come out of a crisis that was caused by overspending or over indebtedness to incur more debt. The response is ethical and moral in nature, and our debates tend to be very ethically charged. So we want to bring some of that energy into today's sessions, and we want to clarify the trade-offs in that sense. Now, this morning we're going to talk about economic justice. Probably the greatest philosopher of the second half of the 20th century, John Rawls, defined justice as requiring any action by a society that it not hurt the least well off. Well, that raises the question of which society we're talking about. Are we talking about the American society? Who is us? Or are we citizens of the world? As Adam just laid out, the consensus point of view perhaps at this institute and among many economists is that globalization, especially in the last 20 years, has produced enormous gains for the poorest people in the world. There's some dissenting views on that we may hear today. But at the same time, there's a consensus view that in the United States, globalization has at least contributed, and there's a debate about the degree of that, to many of our economic problems at home, to wage stagnation, to unemployment, to inequality, as Adam said. So we want our panelists to wrestle with that. The title of this first session is The Duties to Domestic versus Global Welfare. And I want to start off, I think what I'll do is introduce each panelist one at a time. So I'd like to start off with Ann Krueger, who is senior researcher, professor at our neighboring institution, SAIS, at Johns Hopkins, next door. But she has served as at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are in the top positions there, which are the guardians, the institutions that have been set up to preside over the globalization that we've seen since World War II, since the end of World War II. And Ann, welcome. I want to ask you to begin by telling us whether you see the contribution made by globalization to have created inequalities in the United States and around the world, aside from the enhancing and increasing everyone's welfare, and to answer the question whether you see a tension between national and global welfare on that. And because of your great experience at helping to run and running these important international economic institutions, to maybe tell us a little bit about what each country, especially the United States, owes those institutions. We'll start with Anne. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't think those are easy questions to grapple with in the time allotted, but let me try a little bit at least. The first thing to say, I think, is that there are a lot of issues where there are more than one possible policy response. And some of the policy responses are much more consistent with world welfare and with domestic welfare than others. And I take, just as a case in point, we worry, and you mentioned already, Steve, the issue of what's happened to wages and what's happened to unemployment as a result of the recession. Well, one kind of response that some people have had is we have to protect ourselves against those mean, low-wage guys, which would have a number of consequences, most of which would be negative, certainly in the long run, and many even in the short run. There are alternative ways of dealing with the same issue, as, for example, more retraining programs, more education over the longer term, more unemployment benefits, and more support to anybody who's, for whatever reason, unemployed in the shorter term, which, by the way, would have a much bigger effect in terms of where we want it to hit, because it's very hard to say who was laid off for what reason. The idea that we could say, okay, you were laid off on account of how foreign trade did it, you were laid off on account of how there was an incompetent manager, you were laid off because technology left you outdated, doesn't work. It can't work, and not only that, it invites all kinds of stories from all kinds of producers to the extent why they deserve their protection from foreign competitors as well, and it leads to a very negative kind of political economy domestically. The alternative, which is to treat citizens in our country as we think they should be treated, i.e. unemployment benefits, if that's it, retraining alternatives, if that's it, and so more educational support, is one that is not inconsistent with the global part of the welfare. And I think that many of the kinds of things that we hear about are that kind. But that much said, let me now turn more directly to Steve's question, which has to do with, well, what about the obligations internationally? You could turn that question around and ask, what about the obligations of the citizens of a suburb of Washington? Do they owe it to themselves, or do they owe it to their state or their county, I suppose, or their state, or the greater metropolitan area? What is the area in which you owe something ethically? And it seems to me that much, as I've thought about this since I was invited to talk on this panel, much of the discussion of many of the issues that seem to present conflict between the two come about because I think there's a failure to recognize that we all surrender some of our personal, if you like, freedom, because there are things we're not going to shout fire in a theater. That's not in anybody's interest, we think. And there are many things like that. We all drive on the right-hand side of the road here and the left-hand side of the road in the UK. Okay, there's reason for that too. I mean, there's just some things that it's better to have a uniform agreement as to how we will do that, and it makes everybody better off, except, of course, the poor Brit who comes to the US and has to learn to drive on the right, and even he's going to get there very quickly, or he'll know why. So in any event, there are a number of issues where international agreements make sense. And international organizations are there for that purpose. And they are represented, hopefully, by democratic governments. And there's an issue there, I would be the first to agree. But as long as the governments are representative of the wishes of the people, and as long as there are agreements internationally, it seems to me that there is a role for international organizations where it's not a conflict in any longer-term sense of the word. To have an international agreement, for example, on civil aviation that says that when we fly airplanes over Europe, we will let the air traffic controllers there know where we're going. It's not at all a conflict. Then you can take it further and further and further down the path, however far you want to go. You could ask, well, what about banks? Well, if we have international banking, and there are clearly some benefits to it, if we have international banking, the next question is, of course, do we want to have every country have its own regulations, or is there some benefit to us of having more or less uniform, at least on some things, regulations covering banks all over the world, or will we have a situation where we regulate our banks and so the foreign banks get all the business? Well, we don't like that, so then we reach an agreement. Now, if we reach an agreement with others, we are not, on everything, going to get our way. Although we get our way more than any other country just because we're the biggest, but we're not going to. And then gets to be the question, well, where is it that this conflict of interest comes in, and who is the one that's hurt by not having the agreement, who is the one that's hurt by having the agreement. And I think these are issues that have to be raised. Now, you mentioned that I've done some time at both the IMF and the World Bank, and one of the things that comes out in those organizations is the degree to which, once those organizations are in place, they do not get support very much or very often as organizations. They get support by individual countries insofar as individual countries have things they want to see done in their narrow self-interest through those organizations. And I guess from my perspective, I would argue that there's at least a degree to which more internationalism is in the interest of almost everybody on these things, in many regards, where instead of saying, okay, there's a vacancy in such and such a department, we want a national of such and such a country there, we want the most qualified person. You can't run an organization without that, and yet it's astonishing how often issues of nationality come up in areas where you would think that, okay, yes, of course you want people from different countries. You don't want all of one nationality, but that's not the same as saying, okay, we now have a slot for a janitor on the 4th floor, therefore we need somebody from country X to do it. There are lots of janitors from lots of countries who could do that, or whatever else the thing is. And there are many issues like this where there are international organizations, but they just don't have enough support because what I'll call the narrow interests of getting another US national or British national or Indian national into the organization, or getting something that you want because it would favor your bank, takes precedence over what will be good in the longer term for the health of the organization and therefore the health of the world. So I end up in all of this saying, yes, most of what are seen as dilemmas between globalization and domestic welfare can be tackled by addressing the domestic welfare issues domestically. Not all, but most. There are some issues that do benefit us all if we have some degree of international understanding and even international law governing them. And if we don't, that cuts down opportunities for all as well as other things. What happens when we can't get the unemployment compensation up where we think it should be? That's an issue, and I would certainly agree with that, but I'm not sure the alternative is there. And let me just end by reminding everybody of what they already should know. Taking the U.S. poverty standard today, ask what percentage of the U.S. population in 1900 was above today's poverty standard. Economic historians think the best number is between 5 and 6% only. We're above today's poverty standard in the U.S. Economic growth has proven to be, for many people, not all, but many people, the most important component of getting people out of poverty and lifting them, as we know for China and India in the past 15 or so years. It's important. It's important for people throughout the world. We have not lost so much from China. The last estimate I saw was that the cost of living, the relative prices of the goods that the lower income groups, about bottom 50% of the income distribution, buys more of than the top 50%, are 6% lower than they would be had we not had those imports. Now, that's not a huge number, but it's a big number for a poor person. We keep forgetting that and talking only about some parts of the equation. We forget that exports are there too and they create jobs. We forget other things that go on, and we forget what the alternative is, which might not look as pleasant as we think it would in the abstract, because each of us knows that, well, we could just do this little bit, forgetting that somebody over there is going to say, well, if you do that for him, you're going to do this for me. And there's a lot of that goes on in the political process, which makes opening some cans of worms less appealing than they would be if you could really insulate them from other things. So I guess I come out on the side of saying that, yes, globalization has its problems. Many can be fixed domestically. If you want to protect everybody in their job, as of 1900, you should have prevented any cars, because all horseshoers lost their jobs. Every horseshoer in the country lost their job. Do we want to say that there shouldn't have been any automobiles as a result? Of course not. Does it matter what for the horseshoers whether that was because cars were produced domestically or abroad? I don't think so. It matters to the horseshoers that they've lost their livelihood, but not where that comes from. Lots of telephone operators, remember the old system where they plugged in the wires? They lost it with our whole internet age and everything that goes with it. That's not a globalization per se. That's domestic economic progress and economic improvements in well-being. It has costs. Some people do, and we need to have mechanisms that benefit those people. That's not the same as saying we need to stop the factors that lead to job loss. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Anne. It's now my pleasure to turn to Professor Thomas Pogge of Yale, who is one of the liveliest and most acerbic critics of what he views to be the injustice of the current international system. And I know that you'll address that, but before I bring you to the microphone, I wanted to say that Professor Pogge was a student at Harvard of John Rawls, but he is also part of a generation of thoughtful critics of the limitations of Rawls's theories as they apply to the global economic system. And I certainly invite you to talk about that, Thomas, and to respond to Anne Krueger's last point that the system that we have has delivered benefits over the last 100 years and perhaps over the last couple of decades that were undreamed of, but to what extent should we worry about the ethical limitations of that system, especially as it applies to the current American domestic problems? Go ahead, thanks.
Oh, now that's on, yeah. Good, so the basic view that I want to respond to is the view that is a little bit implicit in the question that you asked me, namely the view that globalization is something that we can have more or less of, and the more of it we have, the better it is for the global poor, but the worse it is for the domestic poor. So there's a trade-off in justice between justice for the world and justice for domestically. In response to that, I think the most fundamental thing to say is that we have to make a distinction between globalization with a capital G and globalization with a small g. So globalization with a capital G is just the generic thing, the creation of some uniform supranational playing field with pretty much uniform rules where innovations can diffuse easily and factors of production can easily find their most productive employment for the sake of accelerating economic growth. Now, that's a generic description, and the details, the little g's, depend on exactly how you conduct this globalization. That is to say, who decides about what those rules are going to be that will uniformly govern the world, and what is the content of these rules going to be. And so globalization could, in principle, there could be dozens and hundreds of different versions of globalization that could be played out that would all fit the general description of globalization. So what's important here, and this goes to Anne's remarks, is how we judge these various different options, these candidates of different types of globalization vis-a-vis each other. And of course, it's tempting to judge them against the baseline of an earlier historical period. So we go back to the year 1900 and we say, well, are we better off? Are we not better off? And we say, well, surely we are better off. That's pretty obvious. And so globalization is good. But I think it's important to see these globalizations also in comparison against one another and to say who benefited from this particular globalization being pursued rather than some other globalization being pursued. What are the relevant costs, the relative costs and benefits of different types of globalization vis-a-vis one another? So for me, the baseline is not 1900. For me, the baseline is other kinds of globalizations that could have been pursued instead of this particular globalization. Now, if we look at that question and ask ourselves who are the great beneficiaries of this particular globalization as we saw it in the last 25 years or so, I think the answer is very clearly it's not the global poor, it's not the domestic poor, it is the rich, and in particular the rich in the richest countries in the United States especially. They have really enormously increased their share of global household income and of national household income. So I've got a few figures for you which are from our friends at the Internal Revenue Service, conveyed through Emmanuel Saez, who is an economist at Berkeley. And he shows, for example, that since globalization began, the top 10% of the US population increased their share of US household income from 33 to 50%. The top 1% increased from 9% to 23.5%. The top 10th of 1% increased from 2.5% to 12%, and the top 100th of 1% from 0.85 to 6%. So a 7-fold increase in this top 100th of 1%. By the way, that is 14,400 tax returns, or 30,000 people roughly. These 30,000 people, 0.01% of the US taxpayers, they have now about half as much income as the bottom half of Americans, and they have more income than the bottom 40% of the world's population. The bottom 40% of the world's population, that is 2,800 million people, 2.8 billion people, they don't have as much income as these 30,000 or 14,400 tax returns. So a tremendous increase, concentration of wealth at the very top. And I think globalization has something to do with it, insofar as those people are in the best position to influence the most lucrative target of lobbying with regard to supranational rules, namely the US government. They are people who are located within the United States and so are in a good position to lobby, and the US government is the strongest player still in negotiating international agreements. And it's also the government that is probably most vulnerable to lobbying. So this was a very cost-effective way of investing in lobbying. Now, let me give some examples of the kinds of institutions that I think have been bad for both the global poor and the domestic poor. 4 examples in particular. One is the enormous increase in illicit financial flows, in particular those having to do with tax abuse. So you have trade mispricing. As you know, 60% of all international trade is now within company trade from one arm of a company to another arm. And companies have a tremendous amount of leeway in how they price that trade, whether they, and of course they use that leeway in order to shuffle their profits from jurisdictions in which taxes are high into jurisdictions where profits are low. And that saves enormous amounts of revenues. The poor countries as a group, the developing countries as a group, lose about $1 trillion annually in terms of illicit financial flows, and much of that is through trade mispricing within corporations. But it's also a big loss to the rich countries. The rich countries have one consolation, namely that most of the shareholders of these companies are citizens of rich countries and may in the end pay some income taxes on the increased profits or dividends or capital gains that they get from these corporations. But basically this is a loss for rich countries and poor countries alike. The second example is the grandfathering of subsidies. So we still have $200–300 billion a year in subsidies, especially in agriculture. And these subsidies are paid by taxpayers in the rich countries, and they make it harder for poor countries to export, in particular agricultural products, into world markets. A third example is the much expanded and strengthened intellectual property rights that were made part and parcel of the WTO treaty in the form of the TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. They've been particularly damaging in the areas of medicines. So before TRIPS came along, India had process patents, which could easily be circumvented by finding a new way of making a particular medicine. And so Indian customers and also people across the developing world had easy access to advanced medicines in generic versions. But that disappeared with the TRIPS agreement coming into force in the year 2005, and now basically anybody who needs an advanced medicine has to buy it from the monopoly provider, the one who owns the patent. And patents are 20-year product patents. That is a condition of WTO membership. And that means essentially that the vast majority of the human population has no longer any access to advanced medicines. That's bad for the poor in the United States, who often don't have health insurance and don't get access to advanced medicine, but it's also bad, of course, for the vast majority of humankind who live in countries where they don't have health insurance and who don't have the wherewithal to buy these advanced medicines. And the fourth thing one might mention is the absence. While there was great insistence of having uniform intellectual property protections, there was no insistence on labor rights, on any kinds of labor minimum wages, for example, or minimum labor conditions. And that led to a race to the bottom in the poor countries, where different poor countries were outdoing each other and offering ever more abusable and mistreatable workforces in order to attract investment capital. And it's also bad, of course, for workers in this country, because firms had a greater temptation to outsource jobs into the developing world, given how poor labor protections were in those countries. So again, workers on both sides of the border were losers, and of course corporations were gainers in this regard. Now, if you look at the way in which these two population groups that we are concerned with were affected, look at the United States first. In the United States, we had a steady decline in the number of poor people until the early 1970s, around 1970 or so. And then our poverty rate has gone up from 11%, which is the low that it reached then, to somewhere around 15% where it is now. This is, I emphasize, an absolute poverty line. It's not a relative poverty line which goes up as the country becomes wealthier, but it's an absolute poverty line first calculated under Johnson, I think late 1963, at $3,165 for a family of four, and it's now at $22,113. So we have an increase in the number of poor, even in absolute terms. The poor have not only not participated in the growth that we've had since the early 70s, but in fact they've fallen backward, and there are now more poor people by that invariant standard than there were in 1971. That's quite remarkable. Of course, I agree that the particular globalization that we had something to do with it, but I also note that this tendency began earlier. It began the early 1970s, and it has also, I think, a lot to do with our education system, in particular that education is a transmission device that transmits poverty from one generation to the next. As you know, education is largely funded through property taxes, which vary from with the wealth of the neighborhood or the district in which people live. And so people who live in poor districts tend to get a poor education. And so we are not really adapting our workforce to the challenges of globalization anywhere near as effectively as we could. Looking at the global picture, we find that the bottom half of the human population has by and large regressed since 1988. This is sort of the earliest that we have reasonably reliable figures for. And they were at about 3.5% of global household income in 1988, and they are now around 2.9%. The latest figures are a little bit higher thanks to the global financial crisis, which reduced the share that goes to the people at the top. So it could be now back to 3 or slightly above 3% of global household income. The figure in itself is worth noting. It's a very, very small figure, maybe smaller than you expected, that the bottom half of the human population has not even 3% of global household income. It's really quite stunning. And that also tells you something about how easily alternative paths of globalization might be able to avoid all that enormous poverty that is still affecting at least 1 billion people in extreme poverty, at least 1 billion people who are chronically undernourished, very large numbers of people. And yes, that is better in percentage terms certainly than what we had in 1900, but it's also a great deal worse than it needs to be. If you look at the bottom quarter, you find that the bottom quarter in 1988 had 1.16% of global household income and has shrunk since then to 0.78% of global household income in 2005. Again, there is a slight uptick in the last 3 years, and hopefully that will be sustained. So in general, I conclude that globalization with a capital G is a wonderful thing. I'm very strongly in support of globalization. It's a huge way of boosting growth and thereby helping poor people both domestically and internationally. But the particular path of globalization that has been pursued, the small g globalization, leaves much to be desired. I think we could do very much better. And in order to do better, we have to pay more attention to the impact of various alternative rule design options on the poor, both domestically and globally. And we also have to find ways to democratize that process a little bit, so that it's not a process where governments, or in particular the elite governments, the top 8 or the top 10 or the top 20, sit around a table, each being influenced by their own little lobbying elites at home, and haggle out what the system is going to be, but where the interests of the vast majority of people in the rich and the poor countries are effectively brought to bear on the content of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, you've given us, I'm sure you've gotten a lot of people's motors running this morning with those comments. Arvind Subramanian, my friend and colleague here at the Peterson Institute, is one of the most thoughtful critics and analysts of globalization, especially as it has affected India, his native country, and China, the subject of his most recent book, or one of his most recent books. So, Arvind, Professor Pogge has just said that we need an alternative path of globalization, with a small g, I guess. And I think you also have some views about the alternative path to make the system reflect the new realities of the changing power structure of the world. And please also address this pressing issue that we've just heard presented, which is that the system, how unjust is this system, both for the poor all around the world and for the poor and indeed the middle class in the United States.
Thank you, Steve. Regardless of the question, I have some things to say, but hopefully my responses will respond to the questions as well. So I want to make 3 points. Point number 1, we're in a new and distinctive era of globalization, and I want to just spell out briefly what how distinctive it is. Point number 2, I want to say is that the tensions between national and global welfare have been vastly exaggerated. Some notable exceptions, one of which Professor Pogge referred to, but I'll talk about the other exception. But by and large, it's been a reasonably just international system, and that's why I think the tensions have been overstated. Point number 3, that going forward, there are changes happening in the world economy that are in some cases going to aggravate some of these tensions, which I want to talk about. But I want to end by then talking about the factors that are going to alleviate the tension between national and global welfare. And I'm probably using this completely wrong. I'm going to call that the Kantian, as in Immanuel Kant, the Kantian revenge against John Rawls. And let me tell you what that is. So please be seated to hear my misuse of philosophy. Okay, point number 1, we're in a new and distinctive era of globalization. I have circulated some notes. I think there are 3 really interesting things about what's happening now. 1, we're in an era of hyper-globalization in the last, I would say, about 15 years or so. I have this chart. If you look at world exports, trade to GDP, for example, it's just rising very, very. So global trade upon global GDP has been accelerating in the last 15 years. And it's been accelerating much more than you would expect, given the underlying changes in the world economy. So we're in an era of hyper-globalization. That's the first feature. The second feature is that this globalization is spreading. It is a democratic globalization. So I have this chart where I compare what is the average income level of a country that was participating in trade in 1870. And that country was about, a per capita GDP of about 55% relative to the US. Today, that average income is more like 40% that of the United States. So that over the last 150 years, more and more countries are participating in trade, and it's not just related to China. The third feature, which I think is distinctive, is that we're seeing more and more what I call a crisscrossing globalization. To me, this is a metaphor for a broader role reversal, the cunning of history, which I want to expand upon. And one example of that is that poorer countries are exporting FDI. Poorer countries are bailing out the richer countries, what I call immoral hazard. So there's a kind of significant role reversal taking place, which I think actually augurs well for the global system. So keep in mind these three factors about globalization. That's point number one. Point number two is that until recently, I think these tensions have been vastly overstated because I think by and large the system has worked well. Now, why has it worked well? I think one, the United States in the aftermath of the war was a kind of hegemon that believed basically in openness and a rules-based system. It's not that it didn't rig the rules, and I'm going to come to that, but broadly it was an open system. So that's one reason. Second, for much of the post-war period until recently, the West has been, reasonably economically dynamic, and so that's always conducive to, to sustaining globalization, where the tensions between the impact of what others are doing on you gets kind of, it's kind of a rising tide that at least hides the rocks. The third reason it worked, of course, is something that Danny has pointed out. We have this kind of a Bretton Woods or the embedded liberalism compromise, where basically you have globalization, but you have domestic institutional arrangements that are not that one can preserve. One can call this kind of what I call Goldilocks globalization. Kind of not too much, not too little, but enough to preserve the domestic social bargain around safety nets, culture, values, etc., etc. A third reason why it's worked well is that by and large, some of the globalization that's taken place has been based on reciprocity. So it's been, and in that sense, I think it's very important to understand that the WTO is fundamentally a more legitimate institution than the International Monetary Fund has been, because the WTO has been broadly based on reciprocity. You open your markets, I open mine, and there's a kind of a broad justice in this, or at least it's kind of a contractually kind of satisfactory. Unlike in the IMF, which I call, IMF usually stands for, it's mostly fiscal, but I think it means insolvents must fawn until very recently, that basically the creditors impose these tough conditions on the debtors, so it's not a legitimate bargain. But otherwise, countries have opened their markets, US has opened its markets, and it's based on that. And finally, of course, openness has worked because it's been accompanied by, a social safety net. The size of government has increased in the post-war period, and so any adjustments from globalization have been reasonably well cushioned because of these well-provided safety nets. Now, there were two major exceptions to this rule. One was intellectual property, where I think the US and the West pursued national welfare at the expense of global welfare, inflicted considerable damage to developing countries. And I know this because I'm one of the authors of the TRIPS agreement sitting in Geneva, and one can do chapter and verse on that. So I think that was a very non-cosmopolitan approach. And the second area where I think, so that was an area where too much globalization was pursued, inflicting harm on the rest of the world. The other area where too little globalization has happened is with respect to labor mobility. We have very, very high barriers to labor mobility, very little migration, and that's because the US has considered the political cost of this to be too high. So the cost benefit, the economic benefits to the rest of the world relative to the political cost of the US have been lopsided, and that's a case where national and global welfare have conflicted to the detriment of global welfare. But these exceptions apart, I think by and large the system has worked well. So I go to point number 3. Now, how are these factors changing in the sense of this conflict between national and global welfare? I think that there are 2 or 3 big factors aggravating these tensions. Factor number 1, the US is no longer hegemon. We're moving to a kind of what people call a G0 or a G2 or a G1 world. And we see the rise of China that is not so open. Now, just as an aside, in this whole debate on Chinese exchange rate policy and Chinese mercantilism, which someone has said has been the world's most protectionist policy in the last 40 to 50 years, I think it's important to understand that it creates some very interesting tensions between national and global welfare. I am a hawk like my boss, ex-boss Fred Buxton, but on the Chinese exchange rate issues, but for completely different reasons. Let me be frank. If Chinese exchange rate policy displaces American workers as an international cosmopolitan, I don't give a damn. But if Chinese exchange rate policy displaces jobs in countries poorer than China, I think that's a case where, as an international cosmopolitan, I think that's very problematic, and that's the reason why I'm against, Chinese exchange rate policy. So the rise of China, a China that's not so open, creates these new and interesting sets of tensions between national and global welfare. Factor number 2, I think it's going to aggravate the tension, is that, as I said, we're entering an era of hyper-globalization. More and more behind the border, harmonization is taking place, and that's going to lead to more tensions, which leads me to my third and very important point, that this globalization, on the one hand, is going to create the need for bigger safety nets. There's a very nice paper by David Otter and Gordon Hansen where they show that increased Chinese imports to the United States has led to something like $12 to $20 billion of extra welfare spending in the United States. So on the one hand, hyper-globalization is going to create the need for greater safety nets, but at the same time, it's arguably going to undermine the ability to maintain these safety nets. How does that happen? I think globalization necessarily means that mobile factors, capital and skilled labor are going to be less taxable, so that the revenue base to sustain these, the social consensus around globalization is going to fray. And I think that's going to create a tension. I want to end on my optimistic note, which is the factors alleviating the tensions. So Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, I'm just going to quote from you, says, he has a very nice paper called The Problem of International Justice. He says, the global scope of justice will expand only through developments that first increase the injustice of the world by introducing effective but illegitimate institutions, think of the IMF as a dictator, to which the standards of justice apply, standards by which we may hope they will eventually be transformed, an example, perhaps, of the cunning of history. Now, I want to talk about the cunning of history, which is what are the factors that are going to alleviate the tensions, which is that this shift in economic power that we're taking place away from the US towards it's not just a shift in power, but it's also leading to some very interesting role reversals, which is, I think, the new cunning of history. And let me illustrate with 4 examples why that's going to minimize the tension. When the United States and the West created, say, the international system, they had power, but power was combined with the fact that these countries thought that they knew their identities then and forever, i.e., they were not behind a veil of ignorance. When the United States negotiated the Bretton Woods, it thought it would be eternally a net creditor, and then it turned out 30, 40 years later, it became a net debtor, and all the rules it imposed as a net creditor are coming back to haunt the United States, first in the case of Japan, now in the case of China. So the US created asymmetric rules because it thought it knew its identity, but that turned out to be not the case because that changed. Secondly, the rules for borrowers were very tough because the West thought that they would be net creditors and they could impose these tough conditions. Lo and behold, now Europe is a big debtor, and now we're thinking about how to soften the terms of conditionality under IMF loans. Another example of the role of history, the reversal of roles, which is leading to more cosmopolitan views on the world. But this applies not just to the rich countries, but it also applies to emerging markets. If Brazil and India and China are now going to be exporting FDI, they're going to be much more careful about how they treat FDI coming in because, they have stakes going outward. So once you're both an importer and exporter of FDI, then naturally you have a more cosmopolitan view because, you're on both sides of the stick, as it were. Even on intellectual property rights, I would hazard that, in 5-10 years, China and India, which were totally against the intellectual property regime 20, 30 years ago, might be much more ambivalent because they want to become net technology exporters. So the point is that, we're going to see all these tensions going forward, some of them going to aggravate, but I do think that the fact of the change in economic power and this role reversal is actually quite optimistic in the sense that, we're going to see a much more willy-nilly kind of cosmopolitan view of the world because, no one is, eternally a net creditor, no one is eternally an importer of FDI, no one is eternally a net borrower or a net importer of technology. So the Kantian revenge on Rawls, I think, holds the most hope for a cosmopolitan view of the world going forward.
Pardon me. Thank you, Arvind. Batting cleanup, William Galston of the University of Maryland and the Brookings Institution couldn't be a more perfect respondent. We've just heard, that's because Bill is not only a writer and scholar on these issues, but also a former practitioner as an advisor in the White House in the 1990s. So let me ask you a practical question. I mean, we've heard a few of all of our panelists agree that there needs to be more, as Arvind just put it, a need for a bigger safety net to protect against the adverse effects of globalization, whether or not you agree that overall, on balance, it's positive, the effects have been positive. But since the 1990s, we've been talking about that, and we haven't done a very good job at creating those safety nets. So we're faced with a situation where we have, in ethical terms and economic problems in the United States that many of us, some of the panelists, find unacceptable. How do we reconcile this, Bill? And please respond to the other comments as you will, and try and summarize where we go from here. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Steve. Some of you may remember the 1992 presidential election, a three-way election, and the vice presidential debate, where Admiral Stockdale sort of bumbled out on stage and memorably began by asking, well, who am I and what am I doing here? And I'm having something of the same feeling. Unlike the three previous speakers, I am not an expert in this area, and I'm not to the same extent parti pris. So it seems to me that the most useful role that I can play is to try to tease out and state as clearly as I can some of the questions that are on the table, so that we can focus the debate at the points of real difference. And I'll begin for what I think is the threshold, namely, what are we talking about? And by that, I mean something very particular. He looks at the 15-year period from 1990 to 2005. During that period, China achieved spectacular 236% growth in per capita gross national income. But the same period also saw a stunning increase in inequality. While the income share of the top 10th rose from 25 to 35%, that of the poorest fifth fell from 7.3% to 4.3%, and this means that the ratio of the average incomes of these two groups increased from 6.8 to 16.3, as average income in the top 10th rose by 370%, while average income in the poorest fifth rose by only 98%. And that's entirely consistent with the sort of the meta story that Tom, put on the table during his opening remarks. He goes on to say, to be sure, an income gain of 98% over 14 years, that's at the bottom, is not bad at all. Indeed, it's not. So then what are we to make of the fact that the absolute well-being of those at the bottom rose very substantially, while the gap between the bottom and top also rose very substantially? And here is Tom Pogge's judgment. China's poor paid a high price for this gain in terms of marginalization, humiliation, and oppression by an emerging economic elite whose greatly expanded share of Chinese household income gives them much greater opportunities to influence political decisions, to give unfair advantages to their children, and to dominate the poor in direct personal interactions. Professor Pogge's bottom line: they would have been much better off with more equal economic growth, even if this would have been somewhat less rapid. From which I infer you mean they would have been better off with an absolute income gain of less than 98% if the decline at the top were even greater. Now, this poses, it seems to me, in very stark terms, the question of whether we're talking about poverty or inequality, because as a non-expert, as I read the impact of globalization over the past generation, it has probably had net both of these consequences simultaneously, globally speaking. There is more inequality, but less absolute poverty. Now, I may be wrong about that, and if that's the case, then someone needs to correct that. But I don't see how one could have such a stunning decrease in absolute poverty in China and other developing countries without the number of absolute poor, and I would add the share of absolute poor globally, going down quite significantly during that period, at the same time that there has been this breakaway at the top. That raises the question, could we have done better? And I will not participate in that conversation right now, but it is a necessary conversation. From a Rawlsian standpoint, have we maximized the well-being of the least advantaged through the structuring of this process? And I leave it to others who know the details and the institutions better to figure out what the right answer to that question is. Talking about poverty, are we talking about relative or absolute poverty? Professor Pogge is quite correct, I think, in talking about the U.S. poverty standard and its growth since the Johnston period. But it is still a relative measure in the sense that it is a U.S. measure and not a global measure. Global definitions of poverty are by, I don't know how many orders of magnitude, but $2 a day, the old math tells me that's a little bit less than $800 a year. And as I recall, for a single person, the U.S. poverty standard is something between 14,000 and 15,000. So we're talking about a difference of 20 to 1 between the U.S. standard and the global poor. If we were to adopt a standpoint, sort of pure cosmopolitanism, everybody counts for one, nobody counts for more or less than one, we would have to say that the poor in the United States are 20%, 20 times better off than the people globally who are right at the global poverty line. What are the moral implications of that? Do the U.S. poor owe something to the global poor? That would be an interesting argument to try to conduct in this country. I do think, and turning to a different point, that it is fair to say that in policy terms, there are some real tensions above and beyond the ones that have been talked about between domestic impacts and what might be called cosmopolitan impacts. And let me just give a couple. As I read the net consequences of the huge immigration flows from Mexico to the United States that have occurred in the past generation, but which have tapered off very substantially in the wake of the Great Recession, there is very little doubt in my mind about the fact that the people who have crossed the border from the south to the north thought that they would be better off if they did, and they were right about that. And not only were they right about that, but the villages that sent them were right about that. These remittances have had huge positive effects on many, many rural villages throughout Mexico. There's a very large, detailed empirical debate about the impact of this immigration on the least advantaged in the United States, but my reading of this, having waded through all of it, is that we're probably talking about downward pressure, of wages for unskilled labor in the United States in those areas most affected by this immigration flow of between 3 and 5%. There's no doubt in my mind about the fact that the people who have profited from this flow in the United States are people like the people in this room. And the people who have paid the price for it are the people who were not in this room. But the people who have benefited from it are people who started off in a much worse economic situation than the people who were not in this room. So, just, unjust. And another example, the huge surge of manufacturing in China. There's no doubt in my mind that the people whom that manufacturing surge brought from the Chinese countryside to the Chinese cities and these centers of manufacturing in pure economic terms have improved their lot very substantially. But I think a fair reading of the most recent assessments of the impact of this development on the United States is that people very far from the top of the economic spectrum have paid a very substantial price. It is true that prices at the bottom have gone down. It is also the case that, that we've already heard reference to David Autor's forthcoming paper. Well, I read that paper in draft, and the estimate is that in addition to the loss of 1.4 million manufacturing jobs directly attributable to the surge of Chinese manufacturing and its impact on U.S. domestic manufacturing, there have been other negative consequences for U.S. manufacturing workers on wages and in the country as a whole for the needed expansion in safety net activities. Speaking of the needed expansion of safety net activities, when I was growing up and reading about this literature, I always, as a non-economist, I was always greeted with an argument of the following kind. Well, this is great because the country as a whole is better off, and those who benefit can compensate those who pay the price immediately of the change, and there's something left over. So everybody is better off, a Pareto superior outcome. Wonderful. But what happens if the winners don't compensate the losers or do so inadequately? And that has been the real world below the top in the United States now for at least a generation. So what is our theory of the second best? That is a moral question, right? You cannot simply assume a can opener, right? This is a moral question. If we know with a high degree of probability that the winners are not going to compensate the losers for these kinds of policies, then what does that say about the policies? So, the hard choices are never between the first best and everything below it. The hard choices are between second bests if you have good reason to believe that, that some combination of politics, institutional stickiness, and self-interest are going to block the achievement of the first best. The final set of questions on the table, and then I will subside, have to do with the implied moral underpinning of this discussion. And there is a long, I'll now put on my amateur moral philosopher's hat for just a minute, perhaps a little bit more explicitly than Professor Pogge did. There is a long tradition of argument in moral philosophy, about the degree of self-preference that can be defended, the degree to which one can prefer one's own interests to those of others, the degree to which one can prefer the interests of one's family to those who are not members of one's family, the degree to which one can prefer the interests of one's political community over those who are not members of that community. And let me share with you a very interesting comment that the Harvard ethicist made on a 19th century English moral philosopher, Henry Sidgwick. Bach says, on the one hand, he held as the fundamental principle of ethics that another's greater good is to be preferred to one's lesser good. On the other hand, he also accepted what he called the common sense view that our obligations to help others differ depending on the relationships in which we stand to them, relationships of family member, friend, neighbor, and fellow citizen. And Bach goes on to say, I agree with Sidgwick that neither can be dismissed out of hand as morally irrelevant. Well, I will say in my own name, I agree with both Bach and Sidgwick. Neither can be dismissed as morally irrelevant. There is moral weight to the local, moral weight to the more global or cosmopolitan, and moral argument in this area is, I think, in the zone where we are arguing about the relative weight to be attached to those two sets of moral claims on us. We are not free to pretend that either has a moral weight of 0, but we are all too free to argue about the relative weights of those two sets of moral claims, especially when they collide. And I do think that in this conversation, a number of practical examples of actual real-world collision have emerged. We have heard arguments to the effect that this collision could be abated or overcome altogether with appropriate policies, but I have argued that if experience gives us good reason to believe that the most appropriate policies are the least likely to be adopted, then we have to ask ourselves some hard questions about what we should do, not in the world as we'd like it to be, but in the world as we have found it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to exercise my prerogative to throw first some of what you said back at Thomas, and I'd like you to address a couple of things. First, Bill Galston's analysis of what you said. That, I mean, we all know the old phrase, the rising tide lifts all boats. What if all the boats aren't lifted equally, but what if a system that produces an unequal result also produces greater benefits for the boats at the bottom than they would have otherwise had? Please address the critique of that Bill Galston offered, but at the risk of making things even more complicated than they already are, I want to ask you, Thomas, what about the value of freedom of transaction and freedom that globalization represents? I mean, since the time of the Greeks, I think some Greek philosophers said that the gods created the oceans precisely because the gods wanted humanity to trade freely. The idea of freedom of transaction and free trade, which is at the bedrock of the system we have, is a value, and even some would say a moral value. So that if it produces unequal results, some people would accept that because of the value embedded in the freedom of the system. I wonder if you would, and that value is what impedes the kind of changes that I think you would advocate in some cases. So those are two small questions that I'd like to ask you to address, and then I have some more for the other panelists.
Yeah, so on the first question, I would say, I mean, this is essentially the question of how we trade off the absolute position and the relative position of the poor. And I think that it's very clear that both of those matter, and the relative position matters for two reasons. One is, or maybe even three reasons. One is it has an impact on the absolute position itself. It's just a mathematical thing that the larger the share is of the poor, the larger, other things being equal, will also be their absolute share. holding fixed the total product. But more importantly, it has a forward-looking importance in that, of course, the marginalization, the gradual marginalization of the poor, both in this country and also in China, also disenfranchises them politically, right? As we know, campaign contributions play a major role. It's not just only the right to vote, but there are other ways in which you influence political outcomes. And if your relative economic strength declines, you will have less of a possibility of influencing political outcomes, and that could easily lead to an inequality spiral, where in each round you will have worse ability to influence political outcomes, and therefore the outcomes will progressively disadvantage you more. So those two things both have to count, relative and absolute position, and I can't say more about it than the obvious point that the absolute position will be more important than the relative position at very low levels of income, and will progressively become less important as you go to higher levels of income. So I would think that if I were in charge of the American poverty line and poverty measurement, I would say it would be very important to measure poverty in a way that has a strong relative component, even though that is currently not done at all. On the second point, I agree with you that freedom of transaction, as you call it, freedom is a very important value. I would put that as a merely terminological point. I would fold that into justice, just as the way my teacher, John Rawls, has done that by making the first principle of justice one of equal basic liberties. So that's a very, very important thing, but we have to also be very clear about what these freedoms are, which freedoms are important. And the four examples that I gave, I think, are examples where freedom would pull, at least in some cases, in the very same direction. I don't think the freedom to cheat on your taxes, the freedom to reshuffle your profits by mispricing the trade within corporations so that you end up with a lot of profits in the Bahamas, even though you have no operations in the Bahamas, no customers in the Bahamas, no production in the Bahamas. That sort of freedom, you could call that freedom, but it doesn't seem to me to have a lot of moral value. It's basically a way for some people to evade their fair share of the burdens of government. Also, the freedom to receive subsidies, agricultural subsidies that are very common still in the US for cotton, in Europe, in Japan, and so on, doesn't seem to me to be a substantial and an interesting freedom that has any great moral value. Intellectual property rights, again, that seems to be a cost on freedom, right? You are essentially preventing generic companies that are perfectly able to mass produce advanced medicines. You're preventing them from doing that all across the world in order to maximize the profits or increase the profits, and then also the incentives for the companies that have invented a particular medicine. It would seem to me to be much more intelligent if we had a system where pharmaceutical innovators are paid on the basis of the health impact of their innovations, rather than being rewarded by a markup power that is protected by patents. So we need these incentives, and so this seems to me just a much, much better system than the system that we now have. And with regard to labor standards, again, you might say, well, freedom speaks in favor of freedom of contract. So what we should have is a system where people are entitled to sell themselves under the most demeaning, most humiliating, most horrific conditions. If that's what they want to do and get a job that way, or maybe higher wages that way, let them be free to do it. But the problem with that is, again, that people can easily be forced into a position where they have to sell them. There's just no other way to survive because there's a competitive situation among workers, and if some workers are willing to engage in such bargains, if some workers are willing to write away their right not to be sexually harassed, their right to have bathroom breaks, their right to have reasonable working hours and minimum wages, then other workers, in order to survive, will have to do the same. So it seems to me here that there is a freedom argument to be made on the other side for having certain minimal labor standards as well.
Just a quick query. You mentioned in your opening remarks and just now, again, the subsidies of farmers, let's say, in the United States, agriculture producers here and abroad. I think that's a pretty good example of this cosmopolitan versus national interest issue. So tease that out just for a second. If the United States and the Europeans were to end these subsidies, which you seem to regard as immoral in the current system, would that not deepen the problem of inequality and unemployment in the countries that, in the communities that are affected? As Bill Galston said, isn't there a moral imperative to your own to do justice to your own community? This is an economic issue, a matter of economic efficiency as for the system as a whole, but it's also a moral issue. And where do you come down? You come down on the side of, well, just address that for a second.
Yeah, I think the majority of subsidies really go to very big agribusinesses. It's not, they don't go to small family farmers who would then be going bankrupt and would have an economically hard time. The vast majority of them go to big agribusinesses. And yes, these agribusinesses have employees, and there would be job losses, if they had lesser subsidies. But again, the dislocation that would cause is absolutely dwarfed by the number of jobs that could be gained in countries like Mali, who also are trying to export cotton. And you would, for every job that we are preserving here in this country, something around 35 jobs are lost in the developing world. So I think the trade-off is very clear, that we can't, morally speaking, go to the world and say, look, here is the comparative advantage theorem, this is very good, free markets are very good for everybody will gain. And then we say, well, except in those cases where some of our folks, rich agribusinesses and so on, have strong enough lobbies to force an exception. In those cases, of course, we do insist on grandfathering in these exceptions. I just think that's fundamentally unfair, and in this case, a very poor trade-off for the world's poor.
And Krueger, you in your comments earlier said that the problems of domestic inequality can be addressed internally and domestically, but they haven't been effectively. Please, comment on that and react to some of the other comments that Professor Pogge and the others have said, and then I'll go to Arvind, who has some response.
Yeah, I guess my fundamental problem in general is that we sort of say, well, we don't like everything that's there. And I agree, I don't like a lot of it. I certainly think the Farm Bill is atrocious, not because it hurts others, but because it's silly in the U.S. A little recognized fact is that average household income in the farms in the United States has been above average household income in urban areas since 2003, and urban taxpayers are paying. And so if you like to talk even inequality, it goes the wrong way. Not to mention that whenever you have price supports or support for taking anything to do with land, those who have more land get more. So it's also regressive in every sense of the term. So to say that you don't like that, I don't think goes to globalization as a whole. It goes to a particular area. Now that might go back then to who lobbies for what. But I would argue that in terms of the farm subsidy, it has a great deal more to do with 2 senators per state and a lot of poor states having a lot of farmers who push for that, whether it's in their interest or not, rather than something more generic. There are lots of other things I don't like too, but I'm not sure that does it. And when we want to ask what would do better, I think that's where the hard work really comes. Certainly, to say that you think globalization has done a lot of good is not consistent. Does not require you then to say that it's perfect. The world is the best it could possibly be at all. It certainly isn't. Turning to your question about domestic inequality being addressed, first off, I agree that if the body politic decided it wanted less inequality, there are certainly things you could do domestically, and it hasn't done them. Question, if we want to address them another way, how do we know that the body politic will address that? And how do we know that special interests won't get a hold of it even more, particularly in my particular area, which is trade, where, of course, everybody's solution to everything is protectionism, where all the evidence is that protectionism, by and large, not always, but by and large, has done more for capital owners than it has for workers. It is not true that you protect something and immediately all these wonderful things happen. And usually when you protect something, you end up protecting something else and something else and something else. And by the time you've done that, you have thrown out the baby with the bathwater in terms of lots of economic growth and stuff like that. So I would argue that when there's something that you think is wrong with the system, You need to go after what that is that's wrong and ask, what policies can you get to do that, and how will they work? It's not enough to say you don't like it as it is, because I think I agree with most things on intellectual property rights. I can argue that one either way. I agree it's not a slam dunk in either dimension, but there has always been a dilemma in our economies in that the production of new things, invention, technical change, is a private good in production, and once you've invented something, the cost of somebody else knowing it in many cases is very, very low, if not zero. Well, how do you get the incentives for inventing something? Obviously, there has to be some reward to the inventor, and if in the minute there's an invention and say, well, okay, now make it freely available, then you have to compensate. I like the idea of, okay, we'll judge on World Health Standards, but I think that is, according to my public health sources, a morass, that you cannot judge how much the increment to health is from any particular thing. In fact, I was reading just yesterday by chance, nothing to do with this, some article on what has increased obesity contributed to diminished health standards compared to what they would be. And the argument of every medical person who was interviewed was, you can't tell. You can't say with any certainty. One guy had it somewhere between 3 and 20% decrease in life expectancy. Somebody else had it between 15 and 18. I mean, numbers were all over the place, and each of them started by saying you can't do it. Now, if it's for obesity and something as obvious as that, one more medicine that's going to go somewhere is something. The second problem, of course, is that if you couldn't get the ideal will measure the increase in quality of life, which I think you probably cannot. Then the question is, suppose you cut down incentives for innovation. If there's no innovation, then there's nothing for the poor countries to get their generic drugs anyway. And so what have you got later on? In a sense, short run, maybe there's a benefit for existing drugs. What happens later? And one of the things we haven't mentioned here, which is important in all of these, is the time dimension. What may benefit somebody this year and what benefits that same guy 10 years from now may not be the same, and for society as a whole, obviously the benefits of some things are much greater than others. So let me stop there because you want the others in.
Right, Arvind, you wanted to comment, but also as somebody who's been involved in the intellectual property rights issue, Anne has just introduced the issue of how you provide incentives for innovation in a system that would be organized differently, if you want to address that as well. And then I'll go to the floor in a second, so you might start thinking in the final minutes of some questions.
3 quick responses. The first, the question that was posed, can globalization have been better off for the Chinese? 3 points on that. One, Chinese growth, just as a factual matter, has reduced the international inequality in the distribution of income, because if you count one person as one point of reference, then Chinese growth and Indian growth has been unambiguously good for the international distribution of income. Point number 1. Point number 2, the notion that all of that inequality or whatever is attributed to globalization is, I would say, is a little bit awkward as well, because China grew phenomenally in the way it did, largely because of things it did domestically. It had a supporting external environment, and that's still. But because the tone of the question perpetuates, I think, the kind of intellectual inequality in the world, because even if it's a good question, was globalization, could it have been better for the Chinese? That's a question that the Chinese have to answer, and not, it's not a question for the Americans to answer, because they had the tools to make it more or less better, worse or better off. So that's on the Ken Globe. The second point, the fact that we're in a second best world and say, the domestic inequality questions don't get addressed domestically, therefore what should we do? We're in a second best world. Just as an aside, let me say that one of the inequalities in the world is kind of the kind of our political economy here is very difficult to address, but the political economy out in China and India is much more easy to address. So there's a basic injustice in the world as well. And Montek Ahluwalia says, when we have problems, all these guys from the IMF say, just do it, so what, just adopt first best policies. But when it comes here, we say, oh, we have politics, we have Congress, help us, etc., etc. So there's a basic kind of, and that is getting rectified with a shift in power. But that's a more polemical response. But the more substantive response is that insofar as, you can't get the first best policies, I think the way to think about it is to say, what are the things that you need to do domestically by way of safety nets? And as Anne said, there's some things you may have to do internationally to address those things. So for example, in this whole question of, mobile capital, mobile labor, reducing the resources for the safety net in the United States, I think one could make a case maybe that we need international rules on how to tax mobile factors of production. And my last point I would say is that on the list of industrial country injustices, subsidies would not rank amongst my top 10 because the impact on poorer countries is just vastly exaggerated. Danny and I wrote a paper in the Foreign Affairs where Cote d'Ivoire, for example, had an exchange rate change that increased farmers' prices by orders of magnitude compared to what would have happened had the West reduced subsidies, and it had very little impact.
I'd like to take questions from the audience now, but I don't see, okay. Is there a traveling mic? I don't see one. Howard Rosen.
I'm sorry to be the first person to ask a question because I'll have an opportunity later, but I can't miss the opportunity because, Anne, of what you've just said. It seems that, first of all, I think we're off to a very good start because we're not asking the question whether globalization, but we're talking about what kind of globalization. And the issue that I want to take up, Anne, is the question that Steve just asked you and Bill just referred to, is it seems like the institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, they go so far in saying, yes, these are the kinds of things we need to do in order to have an equitable globalization. But then they just stop right there. Now, I could very conveniently talk about unemployment insurance and trade adjustment assistance, but that would be predictable. How about a minimum wage? A minimum wage that reflects productivity gains in an economy. And you enforce it. The IMF, the frustration that I have is that when you say, well, what are we supposed to do? We don't want protection. Well, there are a lot of other things before protection. And not only does the IMF lead them off of their menu, but they don't. But in fact, sometimes they even criticize countries that have them.
Okay.
Okay, that's a question in which people argue. A minimum wage that is relatively low, i.e. considerably below the mean wage in the country, may, if enforceable, be able to bring up some pockets. But in many countries, minimum wages have been set high enough that they have precluded almost all industrial employment. I once worked as an advisor to the government of Papua New Guinea, which at that time, as well as now, was not exactly an industrial country, and where indeed they had imposed a minimum wage which was about 10% below the Australian minimum wage. Now, the result was that the only factory that had come into existence, or was going to come into existence, they've been able to figure out, was going to make chopsticks because they got good wood. Turned out the wage in the Philippines was 10% that in the Papua New Guinea, the result of which is they didn't get it. Now, the minimum wage in that case obviously precluded employment. There was a survey done in Bangladesh after the Levi jeans were made in Bangladesh. There were complaints in the U.S. about the poor conditions for workers. Levi thought they were okay, but they pulled out rather than take the criticism. Some sociologists, and I cannot give you the citation, did a study 3 years later because these girls, they were 13 to 15, 16-year-old girls, and they had worked in the factory, and they'd worked about 6-7 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. They had then had classes for part of the time, and so on and so forth, and they'd been paid. What happened to these girls a year later? Well, about a third, according to the study, were prostitutes, about a third were beggars, and about a third were just on the streets or forcibly married. Now, it's true that it would be nice if they all got the minimum wage and nice working conditions and good education. That's the best solution. One problem with minimum wage, of course, is that in very low productivity countries, if you raise the wage that must and is enforced, you either drive people into the informal sector or you drive people to unemployment. That's about all there is, when indeed it's unrealistic. So I don't think there's anything really undesirable about a minimum wage if it's realistic, but the number of realistic minimum wages that I know of, as contrasted with these that either are unenforceable or unenforced, is very low in the poor countries.
Let's go.
Okay, let me just answer on the IMF. The IMF has no purview over it. The ILO would scream if the IMF did it, but more than that, in the IMF articles it says they cannot get into domestic political matters, on top of which the IMF can do anything at all, really only when a country is in economic difficulties, seeks macroeconomic reforms, and that's got very little to do with the minimum wage in the short run.
Question here. Let's go to that table and then we'll come to you.
Bill Greider with The Nation. I came this morning really interested because I've been writing about some of these ethical issues in a very commonplace way for many years. I thought the subject of ethics and globalization would surely address the global fires in the factories. We had quite recently the worst industrial factory fire in history.
Bill, let me interrupt.
Bangladesh. And it topped the one in Bangkok 20 years ago, a toy factory, which topped the one in the U.S. Lower East Side Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. This is not a complicated economic problem. It can be prevented in a very direct way by governments that simply say, we will not allow imports of products that are produced in factories that are dangerous and that kill people. And one can ask, who loses in that? Well, the producers at the bottom of the chain lose, certainly, but the people gain. The poor countries, wherever they produce shirts and shoes and toys, will gain. And it's not a trade-off here. It is a very direct moral question. Will you allow products to be sold that are based on conditions that kill people, often little girls, and certainly women and young people?
Okay.
If you go, let me finish my point. If you
Okay.
go back to the first example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, and ask, how did they put a stop to that? It took some years, but it took active politics and reformers and labor unions and other organizations demanding reforms in factory conditions and working rules, et cetera, and by the time of the New Deal, that danger was pretty much eliminated.
Bill,
In
let
the
me.
present,
Bill,
one more point.
Bill, we usually let people ask questions, not make points.
All right,
Bill,
then,
I think-
here's my question. Why does the WTO, not to mention the IMF and the World Bank and national governments where these things are imported, refuse to enact the simple export-import controls that would eliminate this danger for workers?
Didn't mean to suggest it's not a good question. I also wanted to say that that will be the subject of the panel this afternoon on private actors. But I want to very quickly ask Anne if you want to address that, and then we'll have one last question down here at the head table.
A big problem in most poor countries is, well, there's several parts to the answer, but one big part is that in most poor countries, the administrative capabilities of the countries are very, very poor. They are also misdirected, but given that they're poor, enforcing something like that would be very difficult from their end. And I can't quite picture the United States or a European country sending in teams of inspectors to factories in countries that might otherwise export to us without their permission. And I think the affront that would be taken with permission would be so great that it would be a foreign policy disaster. Plus, as I said, basically one part of the answer is it's unenforceable. As you yourself said, we did get legislation here. By the time we got it, we were richer than we had been. And by the time we got it, there was a consensus for it. When there's a consensus for it in Bangladesh, there will no doubt be legislation. But in the meantime, how does the United States get influence? You say you want to cut off exports from Bangladesh completely. I don't think we want to do that. If we don't want to do that, I don't know how you do it.
Okay, we're not going to have a debate, unfortunately, perhaps. Final question from Dr. Whitman.
Marina Whitman, University of Michigan. One aspect, one dynamic aspect, which didn't get touched on, was the fact that one of the effects of globalization in poor countries is that outsourcing for low wages in many cases is temporary. That is, you look at Korea, which at one point was a low-wage country and now is a very high-wage country. Something of the same seems to be happening now in China, where apparently their advantage from low wages is eroding. And my question is simply, to what extent does this adjustment process alleviate some of the negative factors that in globalization that have been discussed on this panel?
I can say.
Go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly, of course, the reason that the outsourcing ends is because real wages have risen for the very unskilled workers that we're concerned about, which is part of the proof that indeed in the low-income countries, having those kinds of opportunities really makes a positive benefit for a significant portion of the population, which was below average income before. So I would argue that it doesn't solve the problem that many people here are talking about, because they perceive this as a loss. I think it would be a loss in this country anyway. Textile and apparel employment was going down as a percent of total employment for years before anything came in from abroad. I mean, it's not a new thing. It's just that they are becoming more costly because our real wages are rising, which is not a bad thing according to everybody on the panel. So I think your question is a good one, but I think that basically it goes to the point that the real wages rise and therefore they outsource again, which then helps another country move up the ladder.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have demonstrated at least one thing, that these are ethical as well as economic and efficiency questions. Thank you very much to the panelists. I see that I would get into a lot of trouble from our new president if I didn't bring this to a conclusion so we can keep on schedule for the rest of the day. But I thank you all for your questions, for your attention, and I thank the panelists for their very provocative and interesting comments and willingness to exchange their views with each other. And we'll see you at the next panel after the coffee break. Thank you very much.